Welcome, everyone. I am so glad that you are here. I'm Madeleine Brand. I'm host of Press Play here on KCRW. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we are in the middle of our inaugural Young Creators Project. And that's a 3-month-long submission-based program where LA creators under the age of 21 can submit their work to KCRW for the opportunity to be featured across our channels. So radio, web, social media, the whole shebang. And just wondering how many of you here are young creators who have submitted to the program or plan to. You can put your answers in the chat and I can check that out if I can figure out how to access the chat. Anyway, National Poetry Month, it ends in a couple of days. And so this submission to the poetry part of Young Creators Project also ends in a few days. But tonight we are opening up a conversation about poetry in LA, where you can ask our poetry panelists anything you want, anything about making poetry, your favorite poems, their favorite poems, what have you. And so let me introduce our panelists. We have Rhiannon McGavin. She's an active member of the poetry community here in LA. She was the Youth Poet Laureate of LA back in 2016. And her work has appeared in The Believer, Teen Vogue, the LA Times. She's been on NPR. And she's also the author of the Branches and Grocery List poems. As a 2023 Mitchell Scholar, she will study literature at Trinity College, where she intends to finish her 3rd poetry collection, Computer Room, which explores the emotional realities of technology. Rhiannon, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today.
I'm so happy to have you. And Matthew Cuban is here as well. He is the author of 3032, co-founder of Spoken Literature Art Movement. He's a frequent MC at the Poetry Lounge. He's an award-winning performance coach, and he spent the last 6 years working in youth detention centers across the country. He's serving as the director of camp programming for Street Poets, Inc. Matthew, welcome.
Hey, awesome to be here.
It is so great to have both of you. And I just want to get more history from you. Tell us how you both got into writing poetry to begin with. And Matthew, let's begin with you.
So I started as an ambiguous brown boy in Jacksonville, Florida. Kind of mediocre at just about everything in life. And then I started writing poetry, and it gave me the opportunity to be able to just speak and talk about whatever I want. And I was a baby in my family growing up, so this was like the only way I could get a word in, is if it was like written in verse. Yeah, poetry was just one of those things that just caught me when I was around 13, 14, and just started writing and expressing, and going to random poetry venues all over Florida, where I grew up. And kind of one thing led into another, and it just became a vocation. In 2009, I said, well, let's be a poet. Let's see what we can do with this.
Wow. So you're a professional poet. You're actually earning a living as a poet.
I do.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. And you coached Rhiannon, right?
I did, Rhiannon. And just so you know, when I showed up, Rhiannon was as brilliant as she is at this moment. So it was like, who is this 15-year-old genius who makes Shakespeare shortlist plays on their YouTube channel? Just absolutely amazing. And yeah, got a chance to work with Rhiannon when they were already brilliant. Wow.
Rhiannon, what is a Shakespeare shortlist play?
Oh my God, Matthew, why did you no, in high school and middle school, I would make condensed versions of I'm going red talking. Invent condensed versions of Shakespeare. I would rewrite Shakespeare plays to be like under 20 minutes, and then I would play all the characters with different hats, and then I would upload that to my YouTube channel, and then I would wonder why I didn't have any friends at school.
I think this sounds amazing.
Thank you.
I want to watch these.
I started writing because I had a really big crush on the older cute boy in my children's Shakespeare group when I was about 10 or 11. And I started writing poetry. I knew that the best way to get his attention was to write really long love poems and then never show them to anybody. So I'm still working on that. In the meantime, I was coached by Matt all throughout high school as part of the LA Slam team, and it was absolutely fantastic. Matt's a wonderful teacher, and I'm so excited that everyone here gets to listen to him today. And then I studied writing at UCLA for undergraduate, and I just kept going, regardless of whether or not boys notice me.
Well, I'm sure they do. And and so do you have an ambition to be a professional poet as well and do that?
Yeah, right now I am full-time writing. I also work as an editor and proofreader. So at many different steps of the publishing process.
Okay, well, so I'm going to put you both on the spot and ask you to read some of your work. Matthew, you're up first.
I am very glad that I don't have to follow Rhiannon, so I really appreciate that. But this is a poem that is for my forthcoming poetry book called Good Grief. This poem is called Pericardium, and it's basically like stuff that the heart does. My heart be a Hoover Dam, be a standing ovation, be an encore, a showstopper. My heart be a levee, a construction zone for unsolicited advice, a self-serving, single-use coffee cup. My heart be calloused, be hands, be my father's hands, be the bend in my mother's knees and back, be a bed leaned upon until God or time shouldered her last breath. My heart be fractured, be a broken place, held in place like windshield. My heart be a shield, be a sword with only pointed ends, be pointing me out in a crowd of my temper, be a lighthouse in my torment. My heart be fear, hesitating and skipping, be a murmur of what I really want to say, be saying so much with only a pulse, a yellow light in a city running late. My heart be a heaven, be a doorway, be an opening, be the only way out, be taking everything, be bundled together like firewood. My heart be only a few degrees away from flame, be a ribbon cutting, a cut from the editor's floor. My heart be behind the scene of every scene, a Blu-ray bonus, a director's veto saying, no, this has to stay. This part needs to stay. Thank you.
That is fantastic. Yes, claps, snaps, the whole thing. So talk about how you constructed that poem, like what led to it, what was the inspiration?
So I honestly believe that so much of the world right now is in a state of grieving and not understanding or knowing where within the place of grief you're in. It's like being in the eye of a storm. You never know when it's going to end or what part of it you're in. And I think that because the world is in a state of grief and doesn't necessarily know it, we're all handling that grief in really like unhealthy ways at times. And so this book was dedicated to my processing of grief. I lost my mother about 5 years ago. She's like my best friend, like a twin with no beard. And she was such an inspiration to the work that I did. So this entire manuscript that I'm finishing now was all dedicated to this grieving process and definitely dedicated to my heart and to joy. And I think that there's a lot of rejuvenation, there's a lot of renewal and rebuilding that comes through understanding and going through that process of grief. So yeah, this was just one step in it, and you could probably align it to one of the steps of grief of where it is in the poem or in the book. But yeah, this was just me processing where my heart is, the good, the bad, and sometimes the sad.
Oh, it's beautiful. All right, Rhiannon, tough act to follow.
It always is. It always is. I'm so truly every time I sit down to write, I am so grateful for having studied with Matthew and as well as his wife and teaching partner, Alicia Wise. They're just impeccable together. So I'm going to read from Grocery List Poems, and this is one of my favorite poems in the book. I wrote a lot of this book while I was staying at I was living with my best friend. It was my K-Town residency over quarantine in 2020. And this is one of her favorite poems from the book. So as I read it, I would like everybody to think about their best friend wherever they are in the world right now, and maybe send a little extra light to them. So this is love language. Any tenderness I know, you learned same as me, by sounding the sharp words out until you could hold them. We're still latchkey tomatoes, dirty vines tangled as hair running over dry earth, grown where we can, no trellis, no neat guide for our wanderings but each other. This smooth grammar of lip gloss and borrowed shirts, heads wild out the car windows, screaming inside a good song, stripping down to go jump right through a riptide, that push and pull, another knowledge. When I'm deep in the waves, I can look at you treading these currents. And who else teaches you manners? How to cartwheel, to say no and mean it. But we can fall and find out. Oh, best friends, split this pomegranate and an hour with me. Call me when quiet is too thick to cut. Call me rabid with gossip. Call me when you get home. Sweethearts, did you know friendship and freedom carry the same root? Did you know that with enough water, under enough sun, even the most scraggle-toothed vegetable scrap again? What a burden here. What a syntax. Xylem poised group chat. Us scallions, yellow gold beets, melon radish, holy basil, us zucchini blossoms teaching the ground to laugh.
Oh, gorgeous. Love it. Snaps. And how did you come up with the vegetable metaphors?
Okay, so the form that this poem is written in is an abecedarian, which means that the first letter of each line eventually spells out the alphabet.
Okay.
So I had to come up with words that started with X and Y and Z. So that did guide the process. I think a lot about form, and for me, using a classical or like more constrained form isn't about proving that you can do it and that you can confine to those parameters, but it's like finding the perfect cup for whatever drink that you want to have. Like there's different glasses for champagne, there's different like mugs, etc. So that's how I think about form. So that is where the vegetables came from, and also because I was gardening a lot that year.
And it's just a good metaphor. Period.
We had like a cup of scallions just growing on the windowsill for the whole summer.
Can I ask you both about your process for writing? Do you write every day? Do you write when the muse strikes? How do you go about your process in a very literal sense? And Rhiannon, we'll begin with you.
I do write every day. It's not necessarily a full poem every day, but it will be a couple lines or little ideas for a future draft here and there. I am always thinking about writing, which I think is almost more important for me than actually writing. My drafting process has gotten shorter over the years because I spend a lot more time thinking about the poem before I actually write anything down. So there's a lot of ways that like I structure thinking about books and poems into my day. I have playlists dedicated. I have like little movie syllabuses set up for whatever project I'm working on to just drive myself a little insane, no matter what.
Matthew?
Well, lot less of a tactician than Rhiannon when it comes to creating, but I do also write and jot things every day. I'm an educator, so I'm usually within some type of classroom, and as an arts educator, a lot of times it's different groups. Sometimes it might be a group of young people, sometimes it might be working with incarcerated youth. And I found that if you want young people to write poetry, sitting down and writing poetry in front of them is a really good model to get them to sit and focus as well. So I tend to always try to model whenever I ask, or I'm in any type of workshop, whatever I try to pose to the group, I try to do the same, you know, especially because poetry is about oftentimes digging into vulnerable spaces. And if I'm not willing to do that myself, I don't like asking anyone else to do it. So I do jot pretty frequently, but also I love that Rhiannon brought in about the thinking process, because I think sometimes when people approach something like a writer's block, it's usually because you've ran to a word that you're like, that's not the exact word that I want to say, so I'll never write again. And I think sometimes that we leave out so much of the thinking process of just sitting with our own thoughts and our own feelings before we actually start to approach the page. Sometimes we see a piece and its end product and we think, how can we ever get there? And the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step or one letter. And oftentimes it's usually you chisel a poem out of whatever granite emotion you're dealing with at that moment. So yeah, it's a delicate process, but I think when I sit to create, it's not always like I have to have a finished product. Sometimes it's like I really just want to say a handful of words, and if it flows into something else, great. And if not, I'll come back to it later.
How do you know when you're done? It seems like writing poetry is almost like painting. You could just keep going.
Yeah.
How do you know when you have a finished product?
I think for me, after I've gone through like 7 drafts of it, I think when you first start writing poetry, you're like, done, greatest thing I've ever written. And then the further and longer you spend writing these, you realize there's many drafts that you end up going through. Even when a poem I feel is finished being written, I don't feel like I fully have the poem finished until I've read it out loud in front of an audience, like literally like 10 times. And then I can really embody where I want to go, how I want to say each word. And sometimes that comes into, and then also when you're in the editing process of like trying to make something feel as vocal on a page when you're not the one speaking it, that process is really tedious. And sometimes, I often feel like poems are never really done. Like you can always come back to them and reshape them in some type of way. But you get content with what you have at some point, and you know it when you feel it.
Yeah. So it sounds like the public expression is vital for you in terms of creating. So that kind of interaction with the public to create your poem. Rhiannon, do you feel the same way, or do you feel a more private connection to the poetry?
No, I absolutely feel the same way. My favorite poems are always a dialogue. It's always a conversation with other people. And it's so much fun just being in the audience and hearing new work and hearing someone else read. For me, I know that a poem is done when it just kind of clicks. And that's been much easier to tell over the years, because over the years I've gotten a lot more gentle with myself in my writing process, where I do not feel that I have to completely cover one topic from every single angle in one poem. There will always be another piece and another angle and another perspective to look at something. So knowing that, I can just follow an idea to its natural thread instead of trying to cram everything in. So that was a big step for me, of just like learning when to put the thing down. I also like working with classic form a lot, because it tells you when it's done. Like a sonnet's done when you're at 14 lines, and then you can go back and proofread.
All right. If you all have any questions for Matthew or Rhiannon, please feel free to throw them in. This is an AMA, and you throw them in the chat or raise your hand, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. We've received some questions in advance from folks, so I want to ask some of those. Allison Deutsch from New York wants to know, how should college poetry clubs go about recruiting poets to run workshops? And what is the best outreach for collaborating with these groups? And how can college poets get connected to the best publishing opportunities? Who wants to take that one?
Matt, you have so much experience, on the college tour circuit.
I was like, Rhiannon, you are a college poet. So I think that poets we're a small collective, actually. Like though there are many poets around the world, I think often the poets that are in this more contemporary world, it's a really small place, and we often know each other. So I think when you get plugged into an artist that you really like, it's always saying like, hey, who can you refer me to that might be in my area that does this type of work? There's many resources out there of just like what works for you. But I think when you're wanting to recruit someone to come in to maybe facilitate a workshop, it's always good to just see who's in the natural area of your city or college, and seeing, what people are interested in. What type of artists do they want to bring in? Is there a specific theme that they want covered? Is there a specific topic that they want to work around? And then finding artists from there, and then just asking poets, hey, can you recommend somebody who you think is really great at facilitating workshops that might want to come in? As far as getting college kids excited about writing poetry, I think now is a really important time in the world, as I think every time in the world is an important time. But one of the things we say with an organization I work with called Street Poets is you have to be heard to be healed. And I think so many people are anxious to be heard. The constant quote that's going around in my head for the last few years is "Riot is the voice of the unheard" by MLK, by Martin Luther King. And I think that is very true to a lot of us, especially young folk. We all have a riot within our chest that we're trying to figure out how to get out. And if you can't get it out, sometimes that riot kind of destroys the city, which is your body, which is you, which is your emotional state. And so giving people just the opportunity to just speak and a microphone and a stage is a very, very powerful way that I think naturally just pulls people in.
All right, Peter Lopez, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, my question was to someone that was trying to get involved into the slam poetry world. I was wondering what kind of advice you guys could give, and also if you guys have any venues in mind or any venues that you guys know that are available to spoken word artists.
Yeah, are you in LA?
Yes.
Go to the Poetry Lounge. It's the longest running open mic in the city. It's the best place in the world. I was just at a slam there last week that Matt hosted. And there's so many open mics. Just go and make friends and read your work.
I'd also like to add a possible.
I was just guessing if there's any more in LA.
I was just going to add that there's all kinds of poetry slams that are happening all the time in the city. Some are more high stakes, some are more low stakes, just depending. But the poetry slam community is usually so much bigger than just a city. I recommend checking out some of the regional events that happen. An event that I've been going to, a festival that I've been going to literally since I was 15 years old, is called Southern Fried. It's a poetry slam competition that happens like the first week of June in a different Southern location. I often say it's like the HBCU of the poetry communities, because it's usually run, led, and founded by poets of color from all over the country. And it's a really, really safe space. It's kind of chaotic at times, as poetry can be at times, but I think once you get plugged into things like that, you find poets from all over the world who can tell you things that are happening in San Diego, that are happening in San Jose, in Berkeley, in LA, anywhere you want. Once you get plugged into that vast things, you see actually how small the community is, and you're like, oh, I know you, like you were just here. So yeah, plug into things like that. There's always ways to get involved.
And is that on Zoom? Can you go to these poetry slams on Zoom now?
Some of them are on Zoom. This particular one is the first time we're going to be back in person for the last couple of years. It was a big festival that happened on Zoom last year. This year, we'll be back in person, taking all the safety precautions that we possibly can. And it'll be in Louisville, Kentucky. So if you feel like making that trip, it's a lot of fun. And like I said, there's San Diego does things all the time. And once you get plugged into a couple things, it's pretty easy to find.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Let's move on to Tallulah, who has her hand up. Hi. There you are.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, I am like, my mom and I listen to KCRW like all the time, so it's so cool to see you, Madeleine.
Oh, thank you.
If you saw me in the very beginning, me and my mom both just, oh my God. But okay, on to my question. I've been writing poetry for about like 2 years now. I definitely started in quarantine because I just like had nothing to do. So I was just wondering if you guys like know, because I also write a lot of like short stories as well. Like, so I was just wondering if you guys know any place where I could like try and like get my work published or anything, because that's kind of the goal I'm going for. So yeah.
Yeah, there are so many wonderful online magazines. I would say just start looking for them. And the best way to find like the right magazines to submit to is to actually read them and find the ones that you actually enjoy reading, because there are so many and there's so many different genres and they're run by all, you know, kinds of different people with different writing styles. So don't worry so much about whether, like, of course, like consider whether your own work would fit the style or the aesthetic of the publication, but also look for the ones that you actually like reading and that you would read regardless of whether or not they publish your work, because that will also sustain you through the rejection process, which is part of it.
Matthew, do you want to add in?
Yeah, I totally agree. And honestly, in some of the publishing world, I defer to Rhiannon because she's been so published so widely. But I totally agree. Oftentimes you can just Google poetry submissions and there's many things that'll pop up. So then you have to kind of narrow that search. So I definitely love the idea of finding a poetry magazine that you really relate to, or even just finding a collection of poets who've published with a specific publishing company that you're really interested in, and just saying, hey, I'd love to submit my work. I would say there are things that are constantly asking for submissions and constantly have moments. I know that Button Poetry does a lot of really cool submissions. Not a Cult does a lot of really cool submission work. There's lots of places where you can get involved to have your work kind of take a different step or step into things. I would also say check out like Poets and Writers or just poetry.org. There's lots of really cool places that you can just plug in and find, ooh, I kind of want to submit to that. Sometimes it'll be like a $10 submission. Sometimes it'll be for free, but definitely just throw your work to as many people as possible. That Rhiannon is totally right. That rejection process is part of the process, and it's humbling and it's beautiful, but you also get to learn a lot about your work and a lot about what people are looking for when they're publishing.
All right, could you just, you said like a few names and you said them very fast. Could you just repeat a few of those? Just I'm trying to write it down.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Maybe we can put it in the chat too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah.
Tallulah, did you submit to the KCRW Young Creators program?
I did, yes. Actually,
good.
what I'm writing notes on is the poem that I submitted.
Fantastic. Okay, well, great, and good luck. Thank you for your questions. Sarah asks, and I think this is probably a question for Rhiannon, do you have a favored poetic form, i.e., or e.g. rather, the sonnet, that you really have to break yourself out of, that you have to stop using, I guess?
Yes, it is the sonnet. I write so many sonnets. Even when I'm not writing a sonnet, I will go, oh, this is a 14-line poem. I am like truly trying to not write so many sonnets. I'm trying to look at sestinas and villanelles now, which are really hard. But I do love the sonnet, and it feels like home a little bit to me. They're so
well,
easy.
Shakespeare used it, so you're in good company.
I hope.
I don't think he broke himself of the habit.
I'm definitely trying to get out of using poetic refrain often, which is just the repetition of words. But sometimes it's you get like that Goodwill Hunting vibe, like when you hear the repetition of something, like it's not your fault, it's not your fault. It brings out a whole nother emotion into things. I really love contrapuntals. But yeah, I think when I'm talking about forms, I like finding an interesting form, like something that seems crazy. What I love really working with is pantoums, and pantoums seem so daunting when you approach them, but I love letting people get comfortable with this form that can seem really complicated, but is actually one of the easiest forms to work with. So I like letting elementary school kids learn how to write really complicated poetry. But yeah, I try to dabble in all the forms, but I probably need to stop using poetic refrain so much. Sometimes
they didn't hear it the first time, so you have to say it
Yeah,
again.
exactly.
Come on, Rhiannon. That's why we're friends.
That's what I say to my kid when I'm asking them to do something they keep forgetting to do. Just keep repeating, the litter box, the litter box, the litter box. All right, 15-year-old Ryan Sakai from Big Bear, California wants to know, how do I read poetry the way it is supposed to be read to a general audience? How do I evaluate if my poetry is good? Matt?
Yeah, I don't think I have tricky feelings about this, right? Because realistically for me, I don't necessarily think there are bad poems unless you are trying to be terrible as a person, which those happen, right? But I think if you are dedicating yourself to a moment of expression, if you're dedicating yourself to a moment of emotion, I think that there's something beautiful that comes from that. I think sometimes we get caught up in this idea of whether something is good or bad. One of my favorite writers, an author named Elizabeth Gilbert, said it's not her job to determine what she writes is good. Her job is to sit and write and create and try to navigate this process of being alive and being a human experiencing the world. It's not their job to determine whether or not what they write is good or bad. Their job is just to write, right? And I think sometimes when we get caught up in this idea of, oh, it has to be this or it has to be that, or I have to make it sound like that, you lose so much of your authentic self. And so if you're trying to become great, study yourself, right? Really read lots of poetry, find something that resonates with you, and then find a way to write through that process and see where your own voice comes out. Sometimes I like having like a buffet style where I'm like, oh, I like this poet, this poet, this poet, this poet. I like this genre. I like this type of form. Let me see how I can adapt and make this into my own. Naturally, when you're talking about your own experiences, the poem will be yours and it'll come out with your own fingerprint on it. But don't get too much caught up about sound or things. I think when you get a poem that you feel comfortable with, when you've written it, just say it to as many people as possible. Say it to yourself. I always say, find someone you love, even if that person you love is you in the mirror, say it out loud. Hearing yourself say something out loud is often a really emotional process. I've had poets just like literally recite the alphabet and burst into tears because they're hearing their voice for the first time, really say something. And so just find moments where you can share your work with people that you love, and naturally you will find good footing in your poem.
Rhiannon?
The most important reader to consider is yourself, because you are going to read your own writing more than anybody else. You're going to think about it more, and you are always your first reader. I am always the first person who reads my sentences, and I want to make myself happy. Like, the poem is done, it feels done when it's something that I would want to read, even if I wasn't the one who wrote it. So that's what matters. Like, the poem is good if it's good to you. And as you grow as a writer and as a reader, and as you read more and more and take on more influences, your map of what you think is good will grow and grow, and you'll grow with it. And what a fun process. What a beautiful process you have ahead of you.
It can be kind of daunting, though, I can imagine, for some young poets just starting off. And so another question by Junga Kimmelvine is, what are some recommendations for teens that you have for developing their poetry skills early in their journey, like events to attend, habits to build, skills to practice?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back into reading. I often think like, if you really wanted to get great at basketball, but never watched a game of basketball, you'd probably have a ceiling that you would hit at some point. And I think about that with this craft, or with any craft. Study it, study all of it, study the classics, study the contemporary, and see what feels good for you, right? Just, you don't have to read everything, just read the stuff that's great for you. But definitely reading lots of poetry, and just finding a different ways to say things for yourself. Yeah, and then definitely finding poetry venues, finding places that you can be around poets. There's lots of things in the city of Los Angeles. You can find a poetry open mic pretty much every night of the week. Find a place, go there just to listen, not to be heard, but go there just to listen and see what comes out. And in time, you will definitely grow and develop as a poet.
Yeah, read as much as you can, find your community wherever you are. I know people are zooming in from all over, so even if you're not in Los Angeles, there are poets and writers around you, no matter where you are. And I would also say, if you speak another language, if you can read in another language, honor that, and lean into it, because one of like I feel sharper in English when I am studying French and Yiddish more, because it forces me to think about syntax and grammar and language and diction in a totally different way. So honor your other languages, even if it's not the primary language that you write in. Find friends who are also writers who are your age. That's really important. And also, I'm going to say this, physical exercise is really important, because if you want to be a writer, you're going to spend a lot of time hunched over something. So swimming and yoga and forcing myself to go for a little walk every day is really important. And it also gives your brain a break. I usually, like, writer's block just means I haven't exercised yet that day.
Where do you find that you get your flashes of inspiration the most? Are you out exercising? Are you sitting in front of your computer, or what are you doing?
Me, it's when I'm out in the world, when I'm looking at people and watching people and just being as open and perceptive to things as possible. I would also say that a really important thing for young people who are starting to write is to be really careful about your social media usage. Because if you are, okay, let's say you have 20 minutes of free time. If you are reading your Twitter timeline or your Instagram timeline for 20 minutes, that's much different experience for your brain than reading a book, right? With a book, it's like someone has thought about this for a long time. You're reading one person's thoughts that are complete versus 100 tweets a minute. You're forcing your brain to do a lot more comprehension than if you were reading a book, and it kind of eats up space in my own brain where my own ideas should be. So it's about creating room for your own ideas.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that takes a lot of discipline. It's hard to wean yourself off the social media feeds. Speaking for myself, I will admit it. Okay, so Stacy Rodriguez asks, how did you find your style of poetry? And I think, Matt, you talked a bit about that, just by immersing yourself and it coming to you. Rhiannon, I don't think you responded to that or talked about that specifically.
Yeah, I think your style finds you. And I think one of the best workshops that you can create for yourself is to find your current favorite writer, right? And then look through their old interviews to see who they say that their big inspirations are. And you'll notice that, like, whoever they say like their big 3 inspirations are, read them, and then you'll see how it becomes this like perfect blend that forms their own writing. So for me, I know that like the really big poets that I was reading when I was 15, like 15, 16, like Solmaz Sharif, Richard Sykin, everybody at the Poetry Lounge, like all of the slams that I was going to, I see them so much in my own work. And it's so beautiful to be able to chart out your influences like that.
Who are you reading now?
Right now, I am reading a bunch of stuff I am reading Solmaz Sharif's new book, Customs, which is fantastic. And I'm also reading Warsan Shur's new book. It's great. I'm so happy. I have such a plethora. And I'm reading Mark Fisher for grad school.
Matt, is there anyone that you recommend to read?
Yeah, I think I loved reading Jeffrey McDaniel as a young poet because he felt like the modern day Charles Bukowski at times, but less problematic. But I love Patricia Smith. I love a lot of those greats. And then what's really cool is that I've spent so much time in the poetry world that a lot of my friends have become really incredible and influential poets. So I love reading. I'm reading How the Word Was Passed by Clinton Smith, who's a good homie of mine. I'm reading Homie by Danez Smith. Jessica Salgado's work is absolutely like LA iconic. And all of her work is absolutely brilliant. So I find myself coming back to those things. But yeah, and then also like I find poetry in a lot of different things. I think the way I started being like again, an ambiguous brown boy from the South, music was one of those things that really, really pulled me into. When I listened to artists like The Roots, when I listened to lyricists like Black Thought, or even like Kendrick Lamar, who's absolutely brilliant when you can read his work. I think so many of these things really pulled me into. And as a young person, I pulled myself to more limericks and poems that rhyme, which like Edgar Allan Poe was like the first ever rapper. Like you can rap like The Raven completely on beat to anything. Same thing with a lot of Emily Dickinson. Like all these poets.
I've seen him do it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, I'd love to hear that. Okay, let me see. Here's another question. I write essays in my notebook, but I'm not sure if it's considered poetry or not. What element should I be looking for in my work to differentiate? I don't know whether to call myself a poet or just a writer. That's a good question.
An essay is just a prose poem. If you mess with the margins, like go on Google Docs, play with the margins. I do this all the time, but you make the line break. You can make the page margins tighter, and then that functions the same as a line break, where it looks more. I have to explain this to like the writers that I work with as an editor like twice a week, but it's still like hard to articulate. But okay, so in free verse, right, you break the line wherever you want. And in a prose poem, the line breaks can have just as much momentum and energy behind it, but it's more subtle because the page margin breaks it for you. So you see, like, this is a giant rectangle of text. Still meaningful, so it feels more casual than in free verse. Anyway, you can still be a poet. It's just a
cut out a little bit there. Can you repeat that last bit that you just said? There was a little glitch in your line.
So the beginning and end words of each line can still be very energetic and hold momentum and surprise in them, even when the page margins function as the line break for you. So you are a poet. You're just writing prose poems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think poetry is in almost every aspect of writing at times, depending on how you approach it. And the way Rhiannon's talking about the structure of it is really, really fundamental to where you can say, okay, this is a poem or this is not a poem. But I think, I listen to a lot of comedians, I feel like, are cousins of the poets. So even them are just telling stories, which often feel like poems in themselves. So it's really up to whatever you want to call it. A great creator used to say, it's your shoes. You do whatever you want in your shoes. If you want to call it a poem, it's a poem. If it's a story, if it's prose, it's prose. I think when you are talking about using poetic elements into your writing, then you can say, oh yeah, this is for sure a poem. I'm using these different poetic tools throughout this. But when you're just creating a long list and it is prose, it's up to the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, and I think every writer, no matter what genre they're in, benefits from studying poetry and studying the fundamentals and basics of poetry, because it's the first art form. Like, it's the first form of literature. It's specifically spoken word, because talking existed way before written language did. So I always edit for sound. Even when I'm writing like academic essays, I read them aloud to myself just to make sure it works. And I can always tell when a writer in a different genre began as a poet. Ocean Vuong, who writes essays and novels now, you can tell from his work that he started as a poet, because there's so much clarity and so much lucidity in it. James Baldwin, Ursula K. Le Guin, these people were poets for a long time before they expanded.
Oh, that's so interesting that you can actually see it. So when you have writers that you're editing, Rhiannon, can you tell if they were poets first just by reading their work?
Yes, like, I'm totally biased, but I can because I think that poets are the best. And like, if you're going to be an artist at all, why not study poetry? But I can always tell.
Interesting. All right, so here's another question, which Matt, I think I'll throw to you first. What's the best way to practice my performance style? I get so nervous when I read in public, especially my own work. Do you have any tips?
Yes, Rhiannon will know this because I used to say this all the time. You don't practice till you get it right. You practice till you can't get it wrong. When I get nervous, it's usually because I haven't dedicated enough time to reading this poem out loud. But read it to every person that you know, read it to people you love and people you trust. Call someone on the phone and say, hey, I have this, can I read it to you? The more you read it out loud, specifically to another person, because you can sit by yourself and read it 100 times to yourself, and the moment there's another person there, the nerves, your pacing changes, all of those things switch up, and then oftentimes you're not really practicing the words that you're saying. You're practicing how you're saying it. You're practicing the melody of how you're performing the poem. So it's important that you say it in different ways. It's important that you change your pacing up. It's important that you surprise yourself as you're reading this poem, because oftentimes, we are just, reading to ourselves in a room, but when you can share it with as many people as possible, it'll really, really calm those nerves. It'll really be able to get you in a position where you feel like I've already shared this with people. I feel confident about this. I've gotten feedback from people I know and love, and now I'm ready to share this with whoever or whatever.
There's that great scene in the 40-year-old version. I don't know if you saw that movie with Rhoda Blank, where she gets up and it all comes, she can't remember. She's just standing up there on stage and she's a blank.
Yeah.
Has that ever happened to you?
Yes. And with me, because I have like such a hip hop background, I'll be like, oh no, the poem's gone. Well, I'm going to freestyle now. And sometimes that works. And sometimes I look very silly, but it's been a while since I've looked silly freestyling. But yeah, definitely have drawn a blank, and that's okay too, right? If you get into that moment, it's okay to just read your poem. Right? Like if you don't feel confident enough off of your memory reading it, which often performance is, you're doing it off memory so you can add more of your performance aspect into it with spoken word. It's okay to read. Like it's totally okay to just read your work and crawl through it, depending on how it does. But yeah, drawing a blank is absolutely terrifying. So it's always good to have a little poem in your pocket if you feel like that might happen.
That's a good advice. All right. What about
I remember.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just to train us out of stage fright, Matt would have us do crunches and push-ups and jumping jacks while reciting our poems, because when you get on stage, there's such like a rush of adrenaline. So his way to train that out of us was to have us doing intensive cardio as we memorized our poems. So
Wow.
that works. That does work. Yeah.
Subtle cardio, not too bad.
My spindly writer arms.
All right. Ryan asks, are there any online poetry slams? I'm in California, but I'm in a more isolated town, so it's mostly inaccessible.
I mean, I bet there is.
Yeah. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the last couple of years is how much more accessible in physical events have become. I know the Poetry Lounge still live streams a lot of their events. I was just looking at different poetry open mics in Ireland and England, and they're still live streaming a lot of their events. And it's really incredible that we can, tune in internationally to all of these different places and these different scenes. So there are still definitely poetry slams online. You just have to look for them.
Yeah.
Aiden asks, I once heard that whenever writing or making something creative, it can seem like the most amazing idea in the world, but if you leave the idea in the drawer and come back later and you're still amazed, then you know it's good. Do you think that's a good idea to do that?
I think it's an interesting way to approach it. I think sometimes when I feel like I have a good idea, I try to wait until the last moment before I share it with anybody else. I'm like, well, I have to really grow this plant in like its own, little environment before I can let it go out into the rest of the soil of the world, if that metaphor works. But yeah, I think that's a cool way to approach things. Say, oh, this is a good idea. Let me come back to it later. I used to have a bunch of, I still have a lot of poetry friends. And when we would share cool ideas with each other, we would say, okay, you have 1 week. Because if you don't do anything with that idea in 1 week, I'm going to do something with that idea. And it would kind of let us really try to tackle those ideas as soon as possible. But I think if you have a good idea, run with it and see it comes back. I think oftentimes I'll feel really good about a poem when it's very fresh. It feels like if it's tapped into somewhere like the firmament of like our existence in that moment, it just feels so on time, and I feel it's much more impactful. And then sometimes I'll come back to a poem years later and be like, this doesn't have that same feeling that it had when I first shared it. And I think often that's because of myself. I'm evolving, I'm changing as a person. I think our audiences and as people, we evolve and change as well. So I think, if you have an idea that you feel good about, like Rhiannon said earlier, you're the one that matters, right? If you like it, run with it and create it and let it go all the way to life, and then see what happens. There's more than one crazy good idea that'll come to you, and allow yourself to let that become full as much as possible. I've seen many artists who are absolutely brilliant stick with this mindset of like, oh, it's not ready yet, it's not perfect, and if it's not perfect, I can't share it. And years go by before they actually let the world see how incredible their work is. And by the time they do, that thing that was incredible in that moment may have lost a bit of its spark. So I think if you have something, run with it, let it go out, especially if it's begging to be heard.
Absolutely. Follow your impulses. Once you have a finished draft, you can put it in a drawer and check back in a couple months. But, in the meantime, you're still going to be writing and thinking of new things. So yeah, follow your impulses.
Okay, well,
unless you're like driving, then you have to follow the rules. But
then you can just tell it to Siri and see what she does with it. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Follow your impulses. I like that a lot. So we're going to end now. And I want to thank you both for coming on. It was fantastic to hear from you and hear your advice and all your techniques and your beautiful poetry. Thank you for sharing all of that, your work and your thoughts with us, and also your time. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's an absolute honor to be able to be here. And thank you all for your wonderful questions.
Thank you so much for having us. This was an utter treat.
Oh, yes. And if you have not yet submitted to the Young Creators Project, please do so. You have until Sunday, and you can do it at kcrw.com/youngcreators. Submit a poem or a story. And by the end of the month. So I think that's Sunday. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions about the Young Creators Project, there's another edition of it. It's painting and drawing. That's the next month. You can hit up the events team at KCRW. The email there is events@kcrw.org. Thanks again for coming, and hope you have a good night, and see you later. Bye.